Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. Choice is a publishing division of the ACRL and the publisher of Choice Reviews and CC Advisor. This episode is brought to you by Credo. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice, and for this 4-episode series, my guests and I will be discussing how collaboration and information literacy factor into the first-year experience. These discussions are part of a longer series on the first-year experience that Credo is presenting here with Choice. Next month, we'll look at some of the other components that help make a successful first-year experience program. But right now, and for the next 4 episodes, I'll be joined by Ray Pun, a doctoral student in educational leadership at California State University at Fresno, Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe, Professor Coordinator for Information Literacy Services and Instruction in the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Laura Cole, Director of Library Services at Bryant University. In this first episode, our guests and I start off with a discussion of the results of a study that Lisa conducted on students' misconceptions around information literacy. Her study, called Predictable Information Literacy Misconceptions of First-Year College Students, is out now and published by the Journal of Communications in Information Literacy. Okay, Lisa, you have a really interesting paper available now. Can you take a minute to tell our listeners a bit about that study? What was the question you were investigating, and could you give us a little summary of the results of the study itself?
Sure. It was a really interesting project to do because one of the things that I've long wondered about is why do students hold on to certain practices that we know are not productive practices for college level research? And so I'd really been wondering about this question, and I'd read this book called Errors and Expectations, which looked at the kinds of mistakes that college students make in first-year writing classes. And then most recently, I came across in the book Understanding by Design this notion of misconceptions. This idea that the way that people can have errors can be explained by understanding that sometimes people hold on to an error in a way of thinking because it's based in the success that they've had in the past. And when I thought about that, I thought this could really be a framework for thinking about this issue where I see first-year college students sort of, if you will, hanging on to practices that are not as productive as the ones that we're trying to teach them in information literacy sessions. And so Ray, actually, on the call with us today, had done this very interesting study with Credo and Library Journal, looking at how librarians perceived first-year college students. And when I saw that data, I got in touch and I said, could we use that as the basis for starting to look at this issue of misconceptions in information literacy? So I had 2 library school students at the University of Illinois at Urbana, Allison Rand and Jillian Collier, I want to give them credit,
Nice.
who worked with me to analyze the responses to the open-ended questions in Ray's survey and to develop what we were calling a misconceptions inventory. Those things that librarians saw in first-year students that were impeding their progress, but that represented errors in thinking. Now, I want to be really clear that these aren't a test of whether students or how many students have these errors. This is a look at what are librarians' perceptions. And this is in keeping with Wiggins and McTeague's book, Understanding by Design, because they say that experienced teachers sort of know what these misconceptions are. Mm-hmm. So we did a couple focus groups as well. Long story short, through the process here, ended up with 9 misconceptions that first-year students have in categories of misconceptions about libraries, misconceptions about information access, misconceptions about research process, and then a final misconception about information literacy generally. We were able to look at those and have those validated through the focus groups that we did with those librarians who work with first-year college students.
Okay. So then, can you elaborate on some of what those misconceptions might have been or are?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, some of these, as you hear them, you're going to say, oh, yes, I've seen students with that problem. So, for example, first-year students believe they're supposed to do their research without assistance. We hear time and time again students sort of saying that they don't want to ask for help. Now, I want to be really clear. There could be an affective aspect of not asking for help as well.
Right.
And that could also be a barrier. But that's not the misconception. So, there could be multiple things going on that are impeding students' progress. Another one is that first-year students think Google is sufficient search tool. Now, interestingly, this can also, be combined with this whole issue that students believe that all library resources are credible. So it's not that misconceptions are all consistent with each other, right? And it could be that some students have some misconceptions, other students have other misconceptions, but collectively, these are the kinds of errors in thinking. And one challenge for librarians, since we teach primarily in this sort of one-shot session where we're the guest instructor, we don't have the opportunity to sort of diagnose individual students and see what challenges they're having. So this sort of collective look at this can help us think through our instructional design, even if it's not as robust as if we were teaching a full, semester-length course where we could get to know the particular challenges that each individual student was having.
Right. I did want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Lisa. This idea that the misconceptions are sort of emerging out of, I guess, an incorrect approach to something, but they've had success with that. So, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, a successful error. Are these things that the students are being taught in sort of their in high school, or are these sometimes misconceptions that they're coming up with on their own? Where have you seen some of this originating?
I really wish I had you when we were writing the article. Yes, a successful error. That's exactly what a misconception is. A successful error. Some way of thinking, or if you will, a heuristic, an approach that's been successful, but that is inaccurate in some ways.
Yeah.
And just for a moment, if I can distinguish, because sometimes there's also just things people don't know. So
Right.
In our study, we had started with a misconception that students see themselves as being outside the research community of practice. And as we worked with that, we realized actually first-year students probably don't even know that there is a research community of practice. Mm-hmm. Likewise, we had struggled with this notion of students don't recognize scholarly sources. And we were like, well, maybe they haven't been taught that yet. So those are either mistakes or lack of knowledge, but they're not a misconception. They're not a successful error.
Mm-hmm.
Love that phrase. I'm adopting that for all future presentations.
Well,
so yeah.
So
where do these come from? So, they come from experience. Right? And some of that experience might be instruction. Now, the one I particularly mentioned, all library sources are credible. See, that's an interesting one because I think back to my own career, and when the internet came on and the web, we were quite concerned, I think rightly so, about students relying on internet resources. And so we tried to make this distinction between sort of the unreviewed, uncurated World Wide Web, or as we would call it, the World Wild Web. Yeah. It's so short time ago, but yet it's so
I know.
Clear. And then we would say, but the library sources, you can trust those. Those are credible. We've collected them. Somebody's reviewed them. And I think our intentions there were really good. We wanted to help students understand the notion of information that's been vetted and understanding what the vetting process is. Unfortunately, we reduce that sometimes into this very simplistic notion. Library resources good, internet resources bad. And then this has a pernicious effect, right? Because you can end up with students therefore thinking, all library resources are credible. Now, this is an interesting thing if you work at a place like I do at the University of Illinois at Urbana, because we have a lot of resources in our library collection that are historic, for example, and many of them are outdated ways of thinking. The disciplines have moved on. There's new theories. Certainly, we can find any number of articles historically that would have been written in our scholarly journals from a eugenics perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So are those sources credible? Well, they certainly went through a vetting process at a moment in time, but we wouldn't consider them credible today. And
Right.
so we're not going to get rid of them from our library collection, particularly not at a research university like mine. But we want students to approach those sources still with their critical thinking.
Are your first-year students great researchers? Let's be honest, the answer is probably no. Websites like Google and Wikipedia have spoiled users with convenience while flooding the information landscape with sources ranging from shoddy to outright duplicitous. Credo Online Reference Service can help. Its user-friendly interface gives students the convenience they expect, paired with the authoritative content librarians demand. Features like topic pages, the mind map, and real-time reference make it ideal for demoing the research process during instruction. Visit corp.credoreference.com for more details and to download the interactive Credo FYE guide, Practices for Enhancing Instruction, which features prominent librarians offering step-by-step activity plans and best practices. Right. So then that kind of leads to another question. I mean, it might be naive to even ask this, but I mean, do you find that teaching faculty are stepping in at those moments and saying, yes, go out and do your research for this paper or whatever, this project, but as you look at some of your sources, keep this, you're looking at, keep the information that you're looking at in the context of when it was written, or I mean, are you finding that that's more of something that librarians are handling in that case, and more broadly, I mean, how are you replacing all of this with better working rules?
Right. Yeah. So I have to say, I think faculty tend more to the trying to address the issue of Google is the only research tool you need.
Right.
So it's not so much that, they're pretty pleased if students are using scholarly journals. And I will say, by and large, the way the algorithms work in our scholarly databases, you're going to have to dig in order to find those older historic materials. And certainly sometimes students are digging for those, right? They're writing that comparative essay. I think the bigger challenge that faculty are facing is the fact that it's quite easy to search online, Google or what have you. And then the lack of context is a real challenge for students there. Even if they find a scholarly article, they don't always realize that it is a scholarly article. Alternatively, as we've certainly come to realize in the last couple of years, things can present themselves in very pernicious ways online to lead you to think that they are something that they are not.
Right.
So one of the interesting challenges with misconceptions and what makes them really difficult is that a student is bringing those misconceptions, those successful errors forward, and as long as they continue to be successful, they will not correct them, if you will.
Right.
And there's good examples in other disciplines where students can even take a test showing that they know, if you will, the correct thing, but then when they go back and implement, they revert to those strategies that were found to be successful before. So you can't just tell somebody that they have an error.
Mm-hmm.
You have to create a learning environment in which they sort of bump up against the failure of that belief that they have or that strategy. And how you do that is, of course, challenging, particularly for librarians in our 50-minute kinds of sessions. It's very difficult. Right. Create those kinds of experiences. But I think that we can sort of take some heart that we see that when faculty create a structured and scaffolded assignment, they can help students work through this and kind of develop more nuanced heuristics that allow them to sort of focus in better ways. And in the paper, we do have a set of potential learning outcomes. So for each misconception, if you wanted to teach some students something that sort of corrected that misconception, one of the things is you can't just tell people what the mistake is, you have to tell them what they should believe instead.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, for example, the one we've been working with here, first-year students believe that all library sources and discovery tools are credible. We suggest one potential learning outcome would be first-year students understand that library resources and tools should be evaluated for relevance and quality. I'm not saying this is a particularly profound restatement.
Right.
Just like in our regular daily lives, just telling me I'm making a mistake doesn't help me. I need to know what the right strategy is.
Right. Yeah. So what should I do instead? Yeah.
Right. So we don't want to tell students don't use Google
Mm-hmm.
because, well, first of all, every librarian I know uses Google, right? So it's sort of, they look at us like, yeah, okay. So what we need to do is help them think about Google in the landscape. And so we suggest, again, first-year students understand that library databases provide different search options that are customized to academic search needs. So we're not saying don't use Google. We're saying you need to also realize that there's this other kind of tool, and that tool might be better for you.
Right. So, I mean, I think adjacent to that sort of open web approach to research, I mean, I'd like to get your take on how open access content is maybe or maybe not changing the dynamic here with InfoLit. While we're continuously reminding students that the internet is chock full of potentially misleading information, at the same time, we're building an ever growing, freely accessible body of digital information alongside of the open web. What new issues might we need to be aware of as OA, grows, OA research grows, and how do you see this sort of dynamic impacting what you're teaching in InfoLit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing because now when we it's not that all sources on the internet are credible. It's that we have an incredible diversity of sources on the internet, right? And so what are the key learning outcomes for a student to navigate in this environment? Which, really from a lifelong learning perspective is, where students will be when they graduate. I mean, if they're in graduate school, they'll continue for a while, at least in this sort of environment in which they have these other databases. But, even in the public library, the web is much more the information landscape that is sort of the default landscape for us in our daily lives. And so really, I think what this has come down to is the importance of understanding how information is produced and communicated. And, even with open access, well, does that mean it's open to read, or is it a preprint? So it's the copy that hasn't gone through peer review yet. What does it mean for it to go through peer review? If I have the preprint copy that wasn't through peer review, how is that different than the version of record, which may or may not be open? I mean, these are very complex questions that, I'll be honest, it's very difficult from the documents themselves often to figure out what you have. And so investigating the context of the document is becoming increasingly important and honestly increasingly challenging. And so I imagine we'll eventually see, movement to greater tagging, at least with journal articles and manuscripts, where you'll at least be able to say, okay, I have this version, and then there'll be a code somewhere. Oh, that means this.
Okay.
But even with newspaper articles, we have that same challenge. I see students really struggling to tell the difference between, if you will, a reported article and an opinion column or an essay.
Right. I mean,
These are both genres that are completely legitimate and valuable, but on screen, we lose so much of the context that helps us understand what we're looking at.
True. And then, you're edging into having to have some sort of understanding of how the practice of journalism even works, especially today or at, these times. To, as you say, provide a little bit more of that context around the information that the student is looking at. But Ray and Laura, I did want to sort of pull you into this real briefly. Based on what we've just been hearing Lisa talk about, I'm wondering if there's anything either of you would like to add, or if you're actually seeing this, play out at your own institutions, and anything you want to chime in with.
Yeah, so I really appreciate Lisa's comments and her article, which I encourage everyone to read. It's in an open access journal. And what's interesting is that as I'm listening to what you both are talking about, it reminds me of when I had taught a lot of first-year students, and then the instructor emphasizing the vendor brand being the authoritative and the go-to database. So, there are the giant databases out there. And if the students don't see those brands, like I'll give an example, like EBSCO or ProQuest, then they don't align that brand with credibility. It's just the way the professors sort of grew up in graduate school learning that these are the sources that they had to use. So it's sort of a cycle that it's really hard to negotiate, to look beyond these commercial databases that we subscribe to and look at other sources that don't have necessarily that logo. So even though they have many different types of databases within EBSCO, for example, it's still like hard for them to distinguish. They just still call it EBSCO. So even if they're looking at business or psychology, it's all under EBSCO. It has to be a certain kind of database, and it's very prescribed too. Meaning, like, I feel like when I've taught a lot of first-year workshops in conjunction with the instructor's recommendation, it's always been like, I want students to find XYZ number of print books. I want them to find something in EBSCO. I want them to find something in this, and this. And when we try to negotiate, in that, like, what we can do and in the 50 minutes, it's often like, well, at the end, can you make sure that they go to the stacks and look at the books and maybe possibly come up with a topic serendipitously, because that's what they did. So it's usually for first-year writing and first-year communication that I've encountered this. And I thought, the OA challenge is, like Lisa pointed out, there are many contexts that needs to be discussed and unraveled. But in 50 minutes, it's quite challenging for a first-year program.
Exactly. Yeah, that the branding aspect that's fascinating, Ray. I'm glad you brought that up. And Laura, anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the ways that I think we're trying to break students of thinking of the database as sort of this one place where they go and they find all this different type of information, and they don't really know that it is different types of information that they're pulling up, is when we go into some of those first year classes, we'll actually bring print versions of trade publications, popular magazines, scholarly publications, and bring them and have the students work in groups to sort of look through those materials and see, there might be a magazine that they look through and they can determine, like, wow, there is so much bias happening here. I didn't realize it, with just one single piece, which is how we explain, when you're looking in the database, you might find one article and you don't realize what the context is without seeing it in that full package. And so that has been one way that we've been trying to address getting a real understanding of what they're finding when they're looking through those subscribed to library databases.
That was Ray Pun, Lisa Janicki-Hinchliffe, and Laura Cole. This concludes the first of our 4-part series on how collaboration and information literacy factor into the first-year experience. This episode is brought to you by Credo. Be sure to join us for the next episode, where we'll discuss info literature, the first-year experience, and collaboration in practice, anchored by a case study from Laura, who describes how Bryant University developed an award-winning first-year experience program that deeply integrated the library into campus-wide student success programming. Bryant
University is a smaller institution, and And so one of the nice things about that size of our institution is that we get to know each other quite a bit on campus. And so when different initiatives begin, people are definitely looking for partners kind of across campus.
Find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. On choice360.org, you'll also find information on Choice's entire product platform, including Choice Reviews, CC Advisor, Choice Webinars, resources for college libraries, our white papers, and a whole lot more. A great way to keep up with the Authority File is to join the Choice Authority File Facebook group, which you can access via the Choice Reviews Facebook page. As a member of the group, you can give us feedback, suggest podcast participants, chat with other listeners, and submit new topic ideas. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.